Colin Powell's name is still on the Arlington National Cemetery website. And that fact, weirdly enough, has become a kind of distraction from what's actually happened over the last 18 months in and around the Pentagon. Welcome to another Breaking Ranks podcast. You may have seen a viral claim that Pete Hegseth erased Powell from some distinguished military list. Multiple fact-checkers took that apart. Powell's biography is still there, still accessible under categories like prominent military figures and politics and government. But focusing on that meme misses the bigger story, because there have been real removals, real deletions, and real efforts to push certain kinds of service out of view. Not a rumor. Not a gotcha. Documented actions that had to be reversed only after historians, reporters, and the public noticed. For example, Arlington quietly removed category pages dedicated to African American history, Hispanic American history, and women's history. That meant dozens of biographies were effectively buried, shuffled out of sight. They were restored later, but only after people raised alarms. Around the same time, Pentagon channels removed a feature about Jackie Robinson's protest against military segregation back in 1944. Training materials about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Women Air Force service pilots were pulled from Air Force curriculum the very day Hegseth was confirmed. Information about the Navajo Code talkers disappeared from official pages, too, and returned only after a wave of backlash. This wasn't subtle. According to reporting, Pentagon staff were told to eliminate anything tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion, reaching back through the entire Biden era. Hegseth has publicly mocked the phrase, "Our diversity is our strength," calling it the dumbest line in military history. And he said that about a force that is, in reality, roughly 1/5 female and nearly half people of color. So what does that look like in practice? Let's walk through the sequence as it unfolded, because the order matters here. It shows intent. It shows a pattern. Check out bigsarge.blog for more news article like the one featured here. In February 2025, President Trump fired General C.Q. Brown Jr., only the second black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Minutes later, Hegseth removed Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the first woman to serve as Chief of Naval Operations. That same night, other top leaders were shown the door as well: the Vice Chief of the Air Force, the top judge advocates general for the Army, Air Force, and Navy, and Admiral Linda Fagan, the first woman to lead the Coast Guard. Brown's replacement, notably, was a retired three-star who had to be elevated again to meet the legal requirement for the role. Then in March 2025 came a new fight over sex-neutral physical standards for combat roles. Hegseth demanded a review, framing it like the military had drifted into something softer or politically compromised. But here's the catch: job-related, gender-neutral standards have been the rule for decades. This was an argument that the institution largely settled back in the early 1990s. Yet it was treated like fresh outrage, as though commanders hadn't been living with this reality for a generation. By September 2025, at a rare gathering of generals, Hegseth went further. He announced that combat roles would be measured against what he described as the highest male standard. And he openly acknowledged the likely outcome: if women couldn't qualify for certain jobs under that approach, then, in his words, so be it. That same month, he dissolved DACOITS, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. That group had existed since 1951, created to help expand and support women's participation in military life. Hegseth dismissed it as a divisive, ideological project. But regardless of what you think of the committee, getting rid of it wasn't a neutral administrative tweak. It was another signal about what kind of military culture this leadership wanted to build. In March 2026, reporting from NBC and the New York Times described something even more direct: promotions allegedly blocked by Hegseth himself, affecting more than a dozen senior officers who were black and/or female. 4 Army officers in particular were reportedly removed from a general officer slate. And when the Army's top uniformed leader, General Randy George, wouldn't go along with it, he was pushed out early. By May 2026, The Guardian counted roughly 24 generals and senior commanders who had been fired or forced into retirement. About 60% were black or female. And notably, These departures came without clear public explanations tied to performance. At the same time, the top military leadership turned over rapidly. The end result, as some outlets summarized it, looked like an all-white, all-male Joint Chiefs overseeing a force that does not look like that at all. This was presented as merit, as cleaning house, as restoring standards. But when you replace large portions of leadership and the demographic pattern is that consistent, people are going to ask what the standards actually are and who they're being used against. And that brings us to the part of this story that isn't about symbolism or messaging. It's about sailors living inside steel walls for months on end, and what happens when readiness is treated like a political talking point instead of a responsibility. While leadership was busy policing woke language and reshaping who gets to lead, roughly 5,000 sailors and Marines were deployed aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln. The ship left San Diego on November 21, 2025, originally for what was supposed to be a 7-month run in the Pacific. Then the war with Iran began, and the Lincoln was redirected. By mid-August 2026, CNN reported the ship had been deployed for more than 250 days, with over 200 of those days without a port call, a modern record. Under normal conditions, sailors might expect a port visit every month or so, maybe every 6 weeks. In this stretch, the Lincoln's crew reportedly got 2 brief stops in 9 months, a single day in Guam and a single day in Oman. Other reporting described what that kind of deployment does to a ship and to a crew: mold problems, shortages of food, mail disruptions, plumbing failures. At least one sailor reportedly went overboard and was recovered. And Representative Jason Crow, a combat veteran and member of the House Armed Services Committee, warned in a letter that these conditions were foreseeable and should have been addressed earlier. Then, when asked about it at Joint Base Andrews, the president dismissed the idea that the deployment had been too long. He said, essentially, not nearly long enough. And then he got on Air Force One. It's hard to hear that and not wonder, what does leadership think endurance is? What does sacrifice mean to them? When you're talking about people trapped in a grinding routine and failing conditions for month after month, is the goal readiness, or is the goal just proving you can make people suffer and call it strength? And the Lincoln isn't a one-off. The USS Gerald R. just completed a 326-day deployment, the longest since Vietnam. Other carrier deployments that began in 2024 stretched past 250 days. That tempo is what you'd expect in the early stages of a large-scale conflict with a peer adversary. It requires careful planning, stable leadership, and deep institutional expertise in sustaining people and platforms. Which raises an uncomfortable point: if you're entering an era of extreme operational demand, why would you spend the same period firing leaders who have spent their entire careers learning how to keep that machine from breaking? Now let's talk about another part of the readiness ecosystem that rarely gets treated like readiness at all: what happens after service members become veterans. While the administration sells a warrior ethos, oversight findings described the VA losing more than 40,000 employees in fiscal year 2025, the first net staff loss in the agency's history. The number that jumps out is that most of those were healthcare roles. Thousands of nurses. Hundreds and hundreds of doctors. Schedulers. People whose jobs are not political, not glamorous, and absolutely essential. According to the same oversight reporting, the loss of physicians alone meant an estimated 1.2 million veterans no longer had their VA provider. Think about what that means in practice. You finally get established with someone who knows your history, your medications, your mental health needs, your injuries, your triggers, your paperwork. And then they're gone, and you're starting over in a system that's already overloaded. By January 2026, average waits for a new mental health appointment were reported to be over 35 days nationally, crossing the threshold where veterans become eligible for outside care. In some places it was far worse, around 2 months in Maine, nearly 2 months in Maryland. One clinic in California was reportedly sitting at 134 days after most of its providers left amid return-to-office mandates. And at the same time, the administration floated an interim rule that would have reduced disability ratings for veterans who managed service-connected conditions with medication. In other words, Take your prescribed meds, follow the plan, stay stable, and you could be financially penalized for it. That proposal was paused only after veterans organizations and advocates erupted over it. Meanwhile, proposals remain on the table that would remove or reduce compensation for conditions like tinnitus and CPAP-treated sleep apnea. Analysts estimated that one of those changes alone could affect around 1.5 million veterans and reduce compensation by tens of billions of dollars over 10 years. So when you put these pieces together, you start to see the through line. This isn't just a messy news cycle. It's a governing approach. The argument from this Pentagon is that it's restoring readiness. But what's described here doesn't look like a coherent theory of readiness. It looks like a purity test. Leaders removed in waves, with demographic patterns that are hard to ignore. Historical material about Black service members, Hispanic service members, women, and other groups treated as optional clutter until public pushback forces restoration. Promotion pipelines reportedly blocked. Resistance within the chain of command punished. And meanwhile, the grinding reality of war falls on the people who can't be replaced by a press conference, sailors living for months in decaying shipboard conditions, and veterans waiting weeks or months for mental health care. If you want to talk about warrior ethos, fine. But a real warrior ethos starts with responsibility, not posturing. It's leaders protecting their people, telling the truth about costs, building systems that last, and preparing for the long-term consequences of decisions made in the moment. What's described over these 18 months is something else, a command culture that treats symbolism as strategy and punishment as reform. It's leadership that seems more focused on who can be purged than on what can be sustained. The USS Abraham Lincoln is coming home. But the people who lived that deployment will carry it for years. The leadership ranks may not reflect the country the force is drawn from, even as the force itself stays diverse. And veterans, many of whom can see these patterns because they've lived earlier versions of them, will still be on hold, still waiting for appointments, still watching benefits debated like budget line items instead of anchors of survival. The record is already there. The only open question is whether we're willing to read it as a warning instead of a slogan.